Hi everyone, Mike here with MEG Motors. Today we're going to be looking at this 2012 RMZ250. The owner brought it in to have the fork seals replaced. They're leaking pretty badly. He asked me to do a walk around and see if I see anything else that needs attention. So we're going to do some checks like I would typically do if I was looking at a dirt bike to buy, see if we can find any other issues with this bike that might need to be addressed while it's here in the shop. So let me change the camera setup and we'll get started. Okay, so let's get started taking a look at this bike. Obviously the first thing we need to look at is the front fork seals. This is why this bike came in. You can see that they're coated with oil here, so this is sure sign that they're leaking. If you're looking at a used bike to buy, sometimes owner who might not be quite as honest as he should be will clean the forks off, try to hide the fact that they're leaking. I always like to look down here around the base of the fork, this groove down here. It's harder to get that clean, and so if you see a bunch of oil pooled up down here or the bottom of the fork leg is covered in oily dirt, that's a good sign that the fork seals are leaking and need to be checked. Another thing I like to look at while I'm up here at the front of the bike is the front brakes. It can be a little bit hard to tell on the camera, so I'm hoping this is going to come out. I'm going to use a flashlight and see if we can get in there. There's the front brake pads. Down here we can see, hopefully this is coming out on the camera, you can see the backing material, the metal backing plate right here, and then the friction material down in there. These front brake pads are probably 50% or more worn, so not totally end of life yet, but while we have it apart, I've talked to the owner already and he wants me to go ahead and put a set of front brake pads on it. So we'll do that while we have the front end apart working on the fork seals. All right, another thing I like to check while we have the bike up on the stand, check the steering bearings. It is difficult to check the steering bearings if the bike is on the ground with the weight of the motorcycle on the front wheel. So it's better to get it up on a stand like I have this one. And so we want to turn the handlebars back and forth and kind of feel the movement. The handlebars should turn very smoothly and very easily. If they are notchy or feel gritty or put up very much resistance at all, it's a good sign that the steering bearings are probably bad and need to be replaced. These feel really, really good, so I don't think we have any issues there. I did notice when I was looking over the bike that the hot start lever is missing. Should be right here, should be a little lever there for the hot start. So we're gonna look around and see if we can come up with a hot start lever, get that put back on the bike. And while we're on the subject of leaking suspension components, while leaking front fork seals are a pretty common problem, it's rarer, but something that still needs to be checked is to see if the rear shock is leaking as well. Like I said, it's much rarer. It's also, in my opinion, more difficult to fix. Not that it's not doable, but more work, I think, and like I said, a much less common problem. Look at the condition of the bottoming bumper down there. See if it's falling apart. This one's showing a little bit of wear, but not too bad. The shock doesn't seem to be leaking, so I don't think we need any service there. Another really common issue that we see with used dirt bikes is a worn and stretched chain. When I looked at this bike originally, I could see the chain was very loose. You can see this chain is very, very loose. A loose chain by itself is not necessarily a problem. You can put on a brand new chain, leave it loose, and it's not a problem. It'll slap around, make some noise, but not necessarily a problem. The test that I like to use to see if a chain is actually ready for replacement is to come down here to the back sprocket and grab the chain at about the middle of the rear sprocket and pull it away from the sprocket. And we're looking to see how much of a tooth we can expose. And if we can see more than about a half a tooth, it's a good sign that the chain needs to be replaced. So we grab this chain and we pull it rearward, and bang, we can see an entire tooth there. So this chain is definitely ready for replacement. I also noticed, like right here, we see we got a broken tooth. You see these teeth are getting fairly sharp. That's all signs that the chain and sprockets are worn. It's always a good idea to replace both the chain and the sprockets at the same time. And so we'll talk to the owner about that. Chain and sprockets, quality set, you're probably looking at about $150 in parts. So we'll talk to the owner about that. While I was down here, I also noticed that somebody has coated the countershaft sprocket with some blue silicone. I'm not sure why they did that, but I suspect that it was leaking oil. There are a couple of O-rings on the spacer that's behind the sprocket that stop oil from coming out around the splines of this shaft. And if those O-rings fail, you'll get an oil leak out through the splines on the countershaft. I suspect that's what happened, and the owner's or some previous owner has attempted to fix that by filling it with silicone. So we'll see what is going on back there when we get the sprocket and chain and sprockets off of this bike, and see if we can figure out why that was done, and probably end up replacing those seals. So while I'm back here at the back of the bike, I'll also look at the rear brakes, kind of like we did the front brakes. You can see here, much easier to see on this one, you can see the metal backing plate and the friction material, and there's plenty of material left on these pads, so I don't think the rear brakes need any attention, not this time. Also, while I'm back here, I like to grab the back wheel and pull it side to side and see if I can detect any movement. And on this bike, I can actually feel a little bit of movement. I don't know if you can hear that in the camera, but there's a tiny bit of movement in the wheel. It's not very bad, but there is some movement, and sometimes it can be difficult to tell if the movement is the wheel bearings, which would be right down in here, or if it's the swing arm bearings, which are up here. I did some looking around on this off camera, and I believe that it's the wheel bearings. If I grab the suspension itself, the swing arm, and do the same test, I can't feel any movement. I only feel the movement when I grab the wheel. So I'm pretty sure that we have wheel bearings that are not completely failed at this point, but they're on the way. So we'll talk to the owner about maybe putting in some rear wheel bearings on this one. Also, while I'm walking around the bike, I like to look for anything that's cable operated and pull it through and make sure that the cables are working smoothly and easily. For instance, the clutch here moves smoothly and easily and snaps back like it should, so I think that's good. Same thing with the throttle. You want a smooth throttle, and it should definitely snap back when you let go. If the throttle hangs in the open position, it can obviously be bad if you're riding, so want to make sure we have good smooth cables there, and this one feels good, so I don't see any issues there at all. I also like to take a look underneath the bike and see if I see any oil leaks or water leaks. Looking under this one, everything looks pretty dry. But yeah, I don't see any issues there at all. Look up around the valve cover, head gasket. Everything looks really clean and dry. So while the bike is up on the stand, it's a good idea to grab the front wheel and try to pull it back and forth and see if you can feel any movement or play in the steering bearings here as well. And I actually can feel some slop in here, so we're going to have to look at that a little closer. It could just be that the steering bearings have come loose, which is not unheard of for sure. So we'll check and see if they're loose and tighten them up a little bit, and then rerun our swing test on the steering bearings to see if we feel any roughness once they're tightened back up. Sometimes if steering bearings start to give people trouble, they'll loosen them up a little bit to try to solve the problem temporarily, and that's not really the right way to fix it. But so we'll take a look and see what we see, figure out why we got some play. All right, so now that we have the bike off the stand, we're going to do a couple more tests on the suspension. We're going to grab the front brake and compress the front forks, and we're looking to see that they compress smoothly and rebound smoothly back to about their original position. I don't want to feel any sticking or binding or any funny noises or anything coming out of the front fork. So here we go, and grab the front brake. A couple of quick pushes, everything feels good. It's compressing smoothly, rebounding back where it should. So I don't see any issues there. We're going to do a similar test on the rear suspension. If it's set up properly, there should be some static sag in the bike. We're going to lift the back end to take that static sag out. And when we let go, we expect to see the bike settle back down to its original position. We're going to do the same thing with some compression. We're going to push it down and see if it rebounds smoothly. So here we go. We're going to take out the static sag, let it go. Yeah, it seems to be moving smoothly. Same thing with compression. So yeah, everything feels smooth there as well. If we had issues back here, it would typically mean either linkage bearings or swing arm bearings, or potentially both. And parts alone for that are probably $175, and it's a fair bit of work to replace them. A lot of bearings in there have to be pressed out and pressed in, so it's a good thing we don't have that issue on this one. So that's basically it for the walk around. We found a few problems with this bike, a few things need to be looked at, but nothing catastrophic. Other than that, when looking at the bike to buy, I'll just look at the general condition of the bike. Things like grips that are worn out, levers are bent, plastics, spokes broken or missing, plastics torn up. I see we have one bolt missing on this bike, but it's broke off in the frame, so it must have seized. Not the end of the world. If you find a bike that's in generally poor condition, tires are worn out, spokes are broken, that kind of stuff, it suggests a general lack of maintenance. And you want to consider that when you're thinking about buying the bike. If they don't take care of those issues, there's a good chance that air filters weren't clean and oil wasn't changed as often as it should have been. And so you have to factor all of that in when you make an offer on a bike and negotiate the price and what you're willing to pay for it. So anyway, that's that, and let's get started on some repairs. So this next clip, we're going to take a look at this mystery blue silicone that we found around this front sprocket. As I said in the previous video, I suspect there's some seals behind here that may be missing or leaking. We're going to pull the chain and sprockets and see if we can find any issues back there and possibly get some parts on order if we need some. So the first thing we need to do is remove the chain, and we have the master link right here. There's a clip on it on the outside, and we're going to attempt to push this clip backwards and see if we can get it to pop off. Usually comes off pretty easy. There we go. So that clip is slipped back just like it should. We're just going to pick it off. This outside plate should come off. And then we're going to slide the master link out of the chain. Now that we have that off, chain is loose. We can go back up to the front and pull that chain right off of the sprocket. So if we look at the countershaft sprocket, we'll see it's got a snap ring right there. It takes a pair of snap ring pliers like these. We're gonna put those right in the holes on the snap ring and see if we can get that clip to come off of there. All right, snap ring clip is off, and the sprocket should come right off. All right, so with the sprocket off, I'm actually surprised. I expected to see more silicone behind the countershaft sprocket, but it looks pretty clean. The O-rings that I was referring to are behind this little spacer. We're going to grab that spacer and pull it out. Yeah, and one of the O-rings fell right off. So this is the O-ring. It fits in a little groove in the back of this spacer. There's actually two of them. I can see the other one's up inside there. I'm going to reach in there with a pick. Pull that one out too. So there's the two O-rings that I expected to see behind there. Or I actually expected to see them missing or compromised in some way. They actually look okay. I'm probably going to order some new ones. These are not very bad. They're a little bit stiff, but not too bad. I'm probably going to order 2 new ones and put them in there anyway. But I don't really see an issue there. And the fact that there was no silicone behind the sprocket kind of tells me that I'm not sure why they put that on there in the first place. Maybe they were worried about the snap ring coming off or something like that, but I don't see any reason why they would have put that silicone on there. So anyway, I don't really see any significant issue there, but we'll put some new O-rings on there just to be sure that we don't have a leak after the fact. All right, so some of our parts have come in for this bike, and so we're going to start the reassembly. We have our 2 new O-rings that will go on the back side of this countershaft spacer, the sprocket spacer. And you might think that the way to put these in would be to install them in the spacer first and then slide the spacer on. But if you do that, the O-rings have a tendency to hang up in the snap ring groove, and they can even be cut or damaged when you install them that way and leak after that. So the better way to do it is to put the O-rings on the countershaft first, and then slide the spacer on. When you do that, it'll slide through the groove, and then you push a little bit more and you'll feel it go over the O-rings just like that. And then we have our new countershaft sprocket, 13 teeth just like the old one. We're going to slide that on. No real tricks there. And then we'll put the snap ring on. Snap rings, if you don't know this, actually have a upside and a downside. When snap rings are made, they're typically punched out of a piece of metal, and when they do that, one side will have really nice sharp edges, and the other side, the edges will be slightly rounded. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but it's better to put the snap ring on so that the sharp edges are on the side that's going to be holding back the pressure of whatever they're on there for. So in this case, if the sprocket were to try to pop off this way, we want the sharp edges on this side to give it as much support as possible in the groove. And so this side is the sharper side. This was actually on upside down last time. So we're going to see if we can get that on there. We're going to push that. There we go. And it just snapped into place. So that's the front sprocket install, and we'll move on to the rear sprocket next. Next, we're going to work on replacing the rear sprocket, and the owner has elected to replace the rear wheel bearings. Actually wants to do the front and the rear. So we're going to pull the rear wheel off and get ready to replace both the sprocket and the wheel bearings. First step, loosen the axle nut. Alright, take the adjuster block out. I'll use a brass hammer to tap the axle. Sometimes these come out easy, sometimes they don't. It's a good idea when you're pulling rear wheel, especially with the bike up on a stand like this, to expect that when you take the rear wheel off, the bike is going to drop towards the front wheel once you take all the weight of the rear wheel off of the bike. So you want to make sure that it's supported well enough that it's not going to fall over when that happens. I'm going to reach over here and see if I can pull this axle out. There we go. And that's it. We'll move the camera over to the bench and start working on replacing the sprocket and the wheel bearings. Next, we're going to work on replacing this rear sprocket. Hopefully you can see on the camera the difference between the teeth on this new sprocket and the old sprocket. You can see that the teeth are worn down to a sharp point, and the gaps between the teeth are larger than they are on the new sprocket. All signs of wear, of course, on the sprocket. And when you choose your sprocket, this is a 50 tooth sprocket, and we're putting another 50 tooth sprocket back on it. However, the original sprocket was aluminum and this one is steel. When you pick your sprockets, you have to choose sort of between longevity and performance. Aluminum sprocket obviously reduces unsprung weight. So the weight that moves with the suspension is unsprung weight. And for the ultimate performance in your bike, reducing unsprung weight is important. So an aluminum sprocket might be worth it for you if you're competitive racing your bike and want the best performance out of your bike. The downside, of course, to aluminum is it's going to wear faster than steel. This is a steel sprocket. It'll add a little bit to the unsprung weight, but will last longer than an aluminum sprocket. For this owner, he's not competing, he's just pleasure riding, and so for him, longevity was more important than ultimate performance, so we're putting a steel sprocket back on this bike. There are also hybrid bikes that will have a aluminum frame with a steel ring around the outside. They are kind of a compromise between aluminum and steel. So it's your choice when you replace them. They'll all work. Just like I said, it's a choice between longevity and performance. So replacing the sprocket's pretty easy. We got 6 bolts here we're going to break loose. I like to break them loose by hand, and then I'll put an impact on them. I didn't do that one. And the sprockets usually pop right off. This one seems to be stuck. See if I can get the bolts to come out. There we go. We'll clean that off just a little bit. our new sprocket. So the nuts on the sprocket are lock nuts, so we don't need any Loctite or anything. So we'll just put these bolts back in. And put a nut and a washer back on each one. So I'll run them down with the impact and then tighten them up by hand. All right, that's it for the rear sprocket replacement. We'll get set up and do rear wheel bearing replacement next. In this segment, we're going to work on replacing the wheel bearings, the rear wheel bearings in this bike. There'll be 2 of them on the sprocket side and 1 of them on the brake disc side. More of a load on the sprocket side, so they put 2 bearings on that side. First thing we're going to do is pop the seals out of this wheel. And you want to be careful on some wheels, not all wheels, but some wheels there's a snap ring that holds the wheel bearings. So this bike does have a snap ring on this side. We're going to pop that snap ring out right quick. All right. Then we're going to reach in through the axle hole and try to get a purchase. Sometimes that spacer can be in the way and you have to work on knocking it off to the side a little bit. Just go back and forth, side to side. And there we go. There's our first wheel bearing out. Oh yeah, this wheel bearing is definitely bad, very rough. And here's the spacer that goes between the wheel bearings inside the wheel. All right, so we're gonna flip this over and see if we can drive the two wheel bearings out from the other side. A little easier to get to them now that the spacer's out of the wheel. There's one of them. Looks like the other one broke apart in the process, so we're gonna have to flip that over and see what's going on there. Looks like the race shattered on the way out. So. There it is. So yeah, this race broke as we were driving in them out. So we'll clean that up just a little bit. And installation is pretty much the reverse. Doesn't really matter which side. I have a driver that will fit this bearing. It's important that when you drive these in, you drive them from the outer race and not the inner race. If you drive from the inner race, the drive transfers through the balls and it can dent and damage the races. So we're going to do it with this adapter here on the outer races. There we go. So that one's all the way down. I'll flip this over. It's important to remember to put the spacer back in. Obviously, can't put that in after the fact. And then same thing from this side. All right, that's the first one in. That one just set right in. Next we're going to work on putting our snap ring in. You remember our discussion from the sprocket snap ring. There is an up and a down side on these. And this looks like the upside on this one. That looks good. I'll put a little bit of grease on the lip of the seals here. And a little bit in the back to stop the snap ring, or the garter spring from coming out. We'll go to a slightly bigger adapter for our driver. Drive that seal in place. And same thing on the other side. A little bit of grease in the back of the seal. Grease the lips a little bit. There we go. That's rear wheel bearings replaced on this bike, and the wheel is ready for reinstallation. In this segment, we'll work on installing the rear wheel. I've already run the chain adjusters all the way in preparation for installing a new chain. I've also cleaned the axle and put on a light coat of grease. I like to do this anytime I pull an axle. It makes the axle go in easier on the install, and it also makes it come out easier the next time this wheel is removed. So we're gonna see if we can get this wheel to go back into place. No real tricks here, just lift it into place and slide the axle in. Let's see what we can do here. There we go. Yeah. Again, no real tricks here. We'll put our chain adjuster block in place, washer, and our nut. We're not gonna torque this down at this time. We still have to install the chain, cut it to length, and adjust it before we tighten this nut. So we're gonna stop this process right here, and so that pretty much covers rear wheel installation. So with the new bearings in place, no more play in the rear wheel. Feels really good. Next, we're going to install the chain on this bike. No real secrets there or tricks. I mean, just go up around the front sprocket. Goes up over this roller here. We'll bring it back to the back sprocket. Run it down through this guide. Right here. And bring the two ends together. Get a little better shot on this. Last part is to install the master link. Slip it in from there, put the plate on the outside. And master link always goes on with the clip position so that it won't get knocked off when the chain is running. So we're going to put the clip on this way. So the easiest way again is just a pair of pliers. We're just going to pinch right here and snap it right onto the post. There we go. Last thing we need to do is adjust the chain. I'm going to reposition the camera a little bit. Give me just a minute. Okay, so we're going to work on adjusting the chain on this bike now that we've got it installed. One suggestion I'd make is I've seen cases where these chain adjuster bolts will get seized in the swing arm. It's an aluminum swing arm with a steel bolt, and sometimes the two metals will react and the bolt will seize. So when we had the rear wheel off, I took these out and put anti-seize compound on the bolts and then put them back in, so just to prevent them from seizing in the future. Like I said, those seize in there, it's a difficult job to fix. You have to drill the bolt out and put a repair kit in there. They make repair kits for it, but it's a difficult job. Better to prevent it if you can, so a little anti-seize compound is a good idea, or grease if grease is all you have. So I've already done a preliminary adjustment on this chain. Let's see. And so we have, there's still a good bit of slack in there. I'm going to take that up just a little bit more. That's about right there. And then we'll look at the mark back here on this adjuster. We'll see that we are about halfway between the first and second mark. And we'll pop over to the second side and put that in the same place. Here we go. We'll start adjusting. And I've snugged the axle up. I like to keep the axle snug while I do this. It keeps the wheel from falling away, sliding too far back in the swing arm while I'm doing the adjustment. That gets us about the right spot. Check the chain one more time. Let me loosen that up just a little bit there, maybe just a little bit too tight. So one of the things you can do when you're trying to loosen the chain and the axle's a little bit snug, you take a screwdriver and put it in between the chain and the axle and pull the wheel back, and it'll suck the wheel right back up where it belongs. That feels better. Yeah. So now, only thing left to do, torque down the rear axle nut. These go pretty tight. This one is 72.5 foot-pounds, which is pretty tight, but that's where they need to be. Back that up just a little bit. All right, so that will complete the chain installation on this bike. We also got our new hot start lever in. This is missing on this bike, so we're going to install that right there. The cable will fit, the end of the cable will fit right in this hole, and that cable will go in that slot, and then we'll stick that up through the rubber. So let's take the pivot bolt out. And we'll take the lever, connect it to the cable. Just like that. And we're going to stick that end of the lever to the dust rubber. Just like that. So I won't put grease or oil on this specifically because grease and oil will attract dirt. Can actually make it worse for it. If this were a constantly moving part, I might put some grease or oil on there, but since this is a seldom moved part, I won't put grease on that. So there we go. Now we have a hot start. Seems to be working well.